Welcome to this video. It's the 6th in the Get Started series. You'll find the files used in this video in the folder int07. In this video we're going to go up a little step perhaps from the first 5 videos in the Get Started series, and we're going to look at perhaps one of the most important aspects of MRDCL, which really is worth trying to learn and spending time to become familiar with. This is called the PreProcessor. Now what the PreProcessor is a tool within MRDCL scripting that allows you to deal with anything that's repetitive in a questionnaire or in the analysis you're doing. And that's quite a common thing that you encounter in questionnaires, things that are broadly the same but perhaps repeated for different things. And we're going to take a few examples and work through those in this session, and hopefully at the end of that it'll give you enough to be able to practice and become familiar with how you use the preprocessor in the language. So I'm going to go down to question 5, which is using the original scripts used, and I'm going to look at question 5a here. And this is a typical question. It's not dissimilar to one we did in a previous getting started script, and I've defined a variable called q5a, and it's a multi. One thing worth noting here, it's a multi because even though it's a rating scale, it's got a top 2 box in there showing anybody who mentioned very good or quite good at the question. So consequently it has to be a multi, because respondents who give that top 2 box will go into that bit of the variable and they'll go into one of the bits in here. So a respondent, if you will go into the variable more than once, therefore it has to be multi. So this is quite a common looking variable otherwise. It's not dissimilar to what we saw at question 4 in the previous video, you can see above. But what we've got to do now is we perhaps want this to be repeated for another brand. Now the temptation might be to do something like this, to go copy, paste, and then go through and edit it and do Q5B. Perhaps it's in the next data location. All the texts are the same, but the brand is perhaps brown or something like that. Now that would obviously work, there's nothing wrong with that. The danger of that sort of thing is that once you start copying and pasting, it'll be very easy, for example, if I copy and pasted it once more, to do something like this. So I pasted it again, I change that to C, I forget to change that to 13, and I just change the title. If I made that sort of mistake, it probably would be difficult to spot it as well, because it would be perhaps in a batch of tables and just one of those tables would be wrong. And so if you ever find yourself copying and pasting, almost certainly there's a better way of working. And the preprocessor is about just that. It's a way of saying, well, I want the same thing over and over again, but actually I want to be able to change that from an A to a B to a C to a D, depending on how many brands or statements there are in our rating scale. I want this to step up from 13 to 14 to 15, and I want the brand that's being rated here to change from variable to variable. So what we have in MRDCL is this preprocessor that gives you a shorthand way of doing that. So I'm going to delete all this code here and take you through some code that you'll find in the script that will automate this for you and allow you to produce this code automatically. Now what we're going to start with here is what's called a data statement in MRDCL. And a data statement is basically just a list of things that you want. So here I've got a data statement, and the first thing you'll notice is that it's in a square bracket, and indeed all preprocessor commands go inside a square bracket. So the square bracket tells MRDCL that this is a piece of preprocessor code, and it's got a data statement here, which, as I say, you can think of as a list. It's been given a name or a number. You can call it pretty much anything you like. You can give it a name. I tend to call my data statements different numbers, but you can call them a name if you find that easier to work with. This one's been slightly arbitrarily been called 15, and in here you'll see that there's a bracket, hash bracket. Now what that means is that the delimiter between each of the items in my data statement is the hash symbol. Now I can omit that and have nothing there, but then it would default to a comma. So sometimes people like to leave the default and use commas, and if I had a comma there and a comma for all the other ones, that would be absolutely fine. But if you want to set your own delimiter, you can just put it in a bracket before the equal sign, and that will act as a delimiter between each of the items. Just like the script we talked about in previous videos, you can have things on separate lines, or you can have them all on one line. So I've chosen to put each item in my list in data 15 on a separate line, but I could just have them across the page if I wanted to, breaking wherever I wanted to. So this is a list, and it's a list of brands, perhaps, that go from A to L, or for 12 items in there. And that list is concluded with a square bracket on the end, a closing square bracket. And you'll see here there's a piece of code that's telling it to count how many items there are in that data statement. So this piece of syntax here says I want to set the value, and I've called this my loop. So set commands do take a text name, and they must be alpha, which comes from data state 15, and it counts the number of items in there. So that's going to actually count how many things in here and tell me that there are actually 12 items in my data statement. So let's move down, and now we can look at the code inside a do loop. Now a do loop means that I want to reproduce the code between the do and the end as many times as it says here. So what it's effectively going to do, it's a little bit like copying and pasting this code, and it says here 12 times, but we didn't need to put 12 in there. We could have actually put the setting of the index my loop in there, and that would have worked just as well, because my loop was set above to be 12 items, and so putting in 12 there would be the same thing. So what this is now saying is I want to reproduce this chunk of code I've highlighted now between the do A and the end A 12 times. So it's a bit like copying and pasting it 12 times, or writing it once and copying it and pasting it 11 more times. And what it's going to do as it goes through this loop 12 times is it's going to take the value of A, it's going to start it at 1 and end it at 12, stepping up one at a time. So the first time through the loop, A is going to take the value 1, the second time 2, the third time 3, the fourth time 4, and so on, up till we get to a value of 12. And then when it finds the value of A inside this loop, it's going to substitute the value it has at that time. So the first time through the loop, A will have a value of 1, and you might think it's going to substitute 1 in there, but this little symbol here, tilde, that little curly sign there, tells MRDCL that rather than putting out the number 1, I want to put out the letter of the alphabet. So A is the first letter of the alphabet, so what it's going to substitute there, rather than put out square bracket tilde A square bracket, the first time through the loop it's going to put A, the second time B, the third time C, and so on up to the 12th time it's going to put out the letter L. And just in case you think that ends at 26 when you get to the letter Z, it doesn't. It carries on to AA would be 27, AB, AC, right through to AZ, then BA, through to BZ, right up to ZZ, and then if you go beyond ZZ, which is a long way through the loop, you would start at AAA, AAB. So it just goes on forever, adding a letter on the end and incrementing the letter effectively, or going through the alphabet with the later letter in each setting. So it's going to substitute Q5A in there for me the first time and B the second. In square brackets now, it's got the value A plus 12. Well, the first time through, A is going to take the value 1. So it'll substitute 1 for A. 1 plus 12 is 13. So in here, it's going to substitute the value 13 as my column number for what follows. This text down here has got no preprocessor code in it, so it'll just repeat that without any changes. everything will get repeated then until we get to here, and you can probably guess what this is telling MRDCL to do. It's saying, I want the first item out of data statement 15. And as you probably remember just now, we just put ampersand as the first item in there. So the first time through this loop, it's going to substitute ampersand instead of square bracket 15.a. And then when we do the second one, it'll put the word Bucknell, and so on down to the 12th one, where it will put Leonard. So that's going to go through and automatically make 12 lots of variables from this piece of code. So it's a much shorter way of writing it, but what's more important is that the chances are, if I get the first variable right and the last variable right, the other 10 in between are going to be right. Now, it's called the preprocessor for a very good reason, that actually what MRDCL does is it generates this script for you before it actually processes and checks it for syntax. It's actually, it's like it's expanding all your code for you and then running it. It's not doing it as it goes along. And if we look at this in the listing file, we can actually see the code, because the listing file, we had errors in the listing file earlier, but the listing file is actually what it's going to generate for us. And here we can see that it's made Q5A, it's put the value for the field as 13, or the column as the 13, it's put the word ampersand in, B 14 Bucknell, C 15 Caledonian, right down to the 12th one, which would be 5L in 24, and the text is Leonard. So what MRDCL is doing with the preprocessor is actually generating all this script for you and then running it. And you can see the expanded script in the listing file, which is obviously a good way to check that you're getting what you thought you were getting. All right, so we've looked at the basics of the preprocessor, and we can see that it's generated 12 times that chunk of code. Let's look a bit more now at some other examples. Here's the description you'll find in the file, explaining pretty much what I've told you here. Now, the reason that sometimes that you use a hash as your delimiter rather than a comma is illustrated here. If the piece of text itself has a comma in it, you would have to use a different delimiter to a hash. Otherwise, that comma there would get treated as a delimiter for one item to the next. So let's move down to the next example. And the next example has a data statement, just 5 things in that one. So it's data 17, it's got 5 items, as you can see. Now this time it's a little bit more tricky, because this time we want the column numbers to step up by 2, but we want the variables to be called Q6A, Q6B, Q6C, Q6D and Q6E. So we want the variables to be sequential, but the columns this time, rather inconveniently, the data locations step up by 2. So what we're doing here is we're saying, well, the column numbers for our data are from 25 to 33, but they're stepping up in steps of 2. So the column numbers are 25, 27, 29, 31 and 33 for our 5 statements or 5 questions that we're asking here. Now, that's fine for that particular loop. So when it pulls in the column number here, it'll just drop in the value 25 the first time, 27 the next. However, our variable names, we want to step up one at a time. So what I put in here is I've set an index called loop count, which I set to 1 outside the loop. So it starts as 1, so that when I call it here in the variable, it will have a value of 1. And of course, that tilde character means it turns it into a letter. So it'll put out 6A. But you'll see just before I leave this loop, I reset loop count to loop count plus 1. So I'm stepping it up by 1 effectively, so that when it comes round to do the second item in here, it will step up the column to 27, but the loop count will step up by just 1. So what it's going to do here, the first time through, it's going to substitute the value of 1 for loop count, which will be A, the letter A. For the data location, the column, it's going to output 25. When it picks the item up from data 17, it will pick up the first one. Now it will step loop count up to 2, because it's adding one on. A will get stepped up to 27 because it's stepping up in steps of 2. And so now what we'll get is 6B in 27, and when it comes here, it will just take the second item from data statement 17, which is Baker, and it will give us what we want, going down to the fifth one in the loop, which will be Q6E in data location 33, and picking up the fifth piece of text in data 17, which is Enderby. We can look at that again in the listing file, and sure enough, here it is, Q6A 25 picking up Armfield, Q6B 27 picking up Baker, and so on down to Q6E, where it's picking up column 33, and Enderby is the brand that it's referring to. So we've seen two examples now of how you deal with loops. One that was a little bit easier, but one where one loop was stepping up in steps of 2 and one was stepping up in steps of 1. So these are really powerful tools that allow you to do anything that's repetitive in MRDCL, and it can equally be applied to your tables. You can automatically get it to do all of the tables in a do loop, and you're really encouraged to do that rather than just copying and pasting. As I said earlier in the video, if you find yourself copying and pasting more than once, you really ought to be looking to write a loop. All right, there's a description again. Now we're going to look at another example, and this time the data statement, data 20 here, isn't a list, it's actually a CSV file, and the CSV file is called CSV input.csv. You can put the .csv in there actually, but if you don't, it's implied that it is a .csv file. So let's open that file and have a look at it, and we can see in here it's a list of data locations 24, 26, 28, and some statements, rating A, rating B, and rating C. And we're going to use that information in this CSV file as input to a loop, and treating this rather like a data statement before. Now the way it's going to read this data statement is a crossword, so it's going to read this 24 as the first item, rating A as the second, 26 as the third, and so on, working down to this rating C as the sixth item in the data statement. So let's have a look at that. So here's again that reference to the CSV input.csv file. Here it is counting the number of items in that data statement or in that CSV file. So what it's saying is that I want to set an index called Q7 items being set to the number of items it finds in the data statement 20. And of course that will be 6 things because there's 3 rows and 2 columns. So it'll have a value of 6. We're going to use that loop count tool again to set the value to 1 before I start. And now I'm going to go from 1 to Q7 items, which is 6 things, remember in that spreadsheet, in steps of 2. Now, you could have stopped at 5 because it will go 1, 3 and 5 here in steps of 2. The fact that 6 will be still the end of the loop, it will just ignore the 6 value and effectively only go 1, 3 and 5. Now we can write code as we did before, so we're picking up the letter A here because the loop count will be set to 1 the first time. But now we're picking up the column from 20.A. So what it's going to do if we switch back here, it'll pick up that 24 for us, do all the text, and then when we come to here, we're not picking 20.A up again, we're picking up 20.A plus 1. So although A has a value of 1 as it comes through the first time, A plus 1 will give it the second value, which will be that piece of text there, rating A. So the next time through the loop count gets stepped up by 1 again. And what we're going to get now is we'll get the letter B here. And then because the A loop steps up in steps of 2, that will have a value of 3, which means it will pick up the 26, and so on and it'll be picking up everything we want. Again, we can look at that in the listing file. There it is, Q7A in 24, 26 and 20 and in 28. Now I can adjust this very, very easily. I could add another one in here, and it needn't be sequential. Let's put it in 31 this time and just refer to it as new entry. Now if I save that, this will now mean that I can just run this script without making any changes whatsoever, because it's all going to be automatic. I'm just going to compile it. If I look at the listing file and select Q7A, you'll see it goes down to Q7D, and there's my new entry in there that I wanted for Q7D. So what we're doing actually is we're using the CSV file to drive what happens in MRDCL. Everything's being automated as a result of what's in the CSV file. I didn't make any changes to the script. I just made a change to the CSV file. Now that's clearly quite a powerful thing and lets you automate quite a lot of things automatically. So that's really taken us through the data stage. The table stage is similar. We've used it here as well. We've set a loop here going A to AAA to 1 to 4. We can select a different banner for each one. And this is a really useful tool that I love in the preprocessor. This bit of syntax here, plus T, is a way of automating your table number. So at the top here, I've set an index T to 0, and this little shorthand bit of syntax here means step up the index T by a value of 1. So what it will do, it'll substitute 1 in there for the first table, 2 for the next, and so on automatically. Every time it finds a plus before T, it will step it up by 1. Now that's a really useful tool because it means that every table will automatically increment by 1, and if I was to add tables in the middle or take tables out, the table numbers would be sequential. As you may remember from an earlier video, MRDCL expects a unique table number for every table. So unless you don't use something like this, or you use a format option that automatically numbers the tables, your tables may not be sequential if you add ones in or you take some out. Alright, so we've got a loop. This time it's called AA. You can call your loops anything that's alpha. You can make it a longer word. You can call it anything you like. I tend to make my loops A, B and C. In most cases, in this case it's AA that's been used. But basically you can do loops, and you can do loops within loops, which we'll cover of course in subsequent videos. So you can produce hundreds of tables here. What this is doing, it's setting an outer loop called AA that's running these tables for banners Q1, Q2, Q3 and Q4, and then inside that loop it's doing all those tables for question 5, A, B, C, D, E and F. So we're actually producing a really large number of tables here automatically, because we're doing, but here this little bit of code here is producing 12 tables for questions 5A to 5L, all within 4 different banners. So it's actually making 48 tables from that line of code and those 3 lines of code there. So very, very quick way of doing things. And you can see there's some more code here for dealing with question 7, dealing with automatically the number of items in question 7, where we change that by adding to our CSV file. So that concludes this introduction to the preprocessor in MRDCL. It really is one of the most powerful tools in there. I'd certainly encourage you to spend time learning how to use it, becoming familiar with it, because it really just saves you so much time, and perhaps more importantly reduces the errors in your scripts as well. I'm just going to go back to the top very quickly, and let's look at one other thing here. You'll see that in these tables we've got CSV2 as a run control parameter. When I now finally run those tables, what we're going to get is we're going to get the tables not only as a big text file in 101 pages of texts, But we will also find that we have got all of the tables in a tables.csv file. So the tables we ran and been looking at in the earlier videos came out in a tables.txt file. You'll find that these tables have also come out in a tables.csv file, which means that you can work with them in a spreadsheet and handle them more easily for charting and so on, although there is a video that shows you how to do that in a much more expert way. So all the tables also come out in a CSV file, and I tend to use the CSV2 option because what it does, it gives you here in column A a marker saying what each row is. So VT will tell you it's a title, BT is the base title, CL down here are the labels, RT is the total row, PV are percentages, and so on. One difference between tables in a CSV file and a text file is that tables in a TXV file have to fit on a printed page, and so they can wrap onto the next page where they're too wide to print. Tables in a CSV file will just keep going to the right hand side, particularly now that's easy to do, that Excel supports huge numbers of columns, and so it can support the widest tables that you might produce in MRDCL. So that concludes this video. I hope it's been useful to you. It really is worth sticking with the preprocessor and learning all its functionality. We'll be using it in several of the videos later on. Thank you.